your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Kyle Morrison stood in his suburban kitchen, watching the morning sun filter through white curtains as he sipped black coffee from his favorite mug. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen the world's darkest corners and lived to tell about it. Not that he ever told those stories. To his neighbors in Maple Ridge, Colorado, Kyle was simply a security consultant who traveled frequently for work. They didn't know about the 8 years he'd spent with Delta Force, or the classified operations that had taken him from the mountains of Afghanistan to the streets of Mogadishu. They certainly didn't know about his current role as an FBI undercover operative, a position that required him to maintain deep cover even at home. "Morning, honey." Linda's voice floated from the hallway as she appeared in a silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 35, his wife of 12 years still turned heads wherever she went. She'd been a real estate agent when they met, successful and ambitious. Now she managed their finances and social calendar with the same precision she'd once applied to million-dollar property deals. "Coffee's fresh," Kyle replied, studying her face. Something had been different about Linda lately. Small changes that most husbands might miss, but Kyle's training had taught him to notice everything. The way she guarded her phone, the new workout routine that kept her out of the house for hours, the subtle shift in her sleep patterns. Linda poured herself coffee, adding cream with movements that seemed almost rehearsed. "I'm meeting Amy for lunch today," she said casually. "Then I have that yoga class at 5. Amy Fletcher, their neighbor from 3 houses down, a recently divorced brunette who'd become Linda's constant companion over the past 6 months. Kyle had run background checks on everyone in their social circle as a matter of professional habit. It was Amy's ex-husband who'd raised the first red flag. Todd Fletcher wasn't just any divorced neighbor. He was a former Army Ranger turned private military contractor, currently unemployed and bitter about the alimony payments that had left him nearly broke. More concerning was the insurance fraud investigation that had quietly closed when his previous girlfriend had died in what appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong. No charges were filed, but the insurance company had refused to pay out the claim. "What about dinner tonight?" Kyle asked, watching Linda's reflection in the window behind her. "I'll cook that pasta you like," she said, kissing his cheek. Her lips felt cold against his skin. "Maybe we can watch a movie after?" Kyle nodded, but his mind was already working. Linda had mentioned the pasta 3 times this week, which was unusual. She'd also been increasingly affectionate, another behavioral change that triggered his instincts. In his experience, people became either more distant or more loving when they were planning something terrible. After Linda left for her morning run, another new habit, Kyle retreated to his home office. The room appeared to be a typical workspace with a desk, computer, and filing cabinets. Hidden behind a false panel, however, was equipment that would make most intelligence agencies envious. He pulled up Linda's phone records first. The burner phone she thought he didn't know about had been active for 3 months. Most calls went to a number registered to a shell company, the kind of setup he'd seen countless times in his undercover work. A few keystrokes revealed the number belonged to Todd Fletcher. Kyle's jaw tightened as he reviewed the frequency of their communications. Multiple calls every day, some lasting over an hour. Text messages that were encrypted, but Kyle had ways around such inconveniences. The messages painted a picture that made his blood run cold. Insurance policy is current. $2 million payout. Needs to look random. Home invasion perfect cover. Wednesday night. He's always in his office until midnight. Kyle sat back in his chair, processing the information with the detached professionalism that had kept him alive in hostile territories. His wife of 12 years was planning to have him murdered for insurance money, working with a man who'd likely killed before. Most men would have confronted their wives immediately or gone straight to the police. Kyle Morrison wasn't most men. He'd spent years learning that the best way to handle enemies was to let them reveal their full hand before striking back with overwhelming force. He opened a new file on his computer and began typing. If Linda and Todd wanted to play a deadly game, he'd give them exactly what they asked for, with a few modifications they'd never see coming. The first phase would be surveillance. Kyle needed to know every detail of their plan, every contingency they'd considered. More importantly, he needed to know if there were other players involved. Amy Fletcher's sudden friendship with Linda couldn't be coincidental, and Kyle suspected the widow next door knew more about her ex-husband's activities than she'd admitted. As he began his preparations, Kyle felt the familiar calm that came before dangerous operations. This wasn't personal anymore, it was business. And Kyle Morrison had never failed to complete a mission. Chapter 2. The Network Revealed. 3 days of intensive surveillance revealed that Linda and Todd's plot was more sophisticated than Kyle had initially suspected. From his position in the woods behind the Fletcher house, using military-grade night vision equipment, he watched through windows as the conspirators met for what appeared to be final planning sessions. Amy Fletcher wasn't just a convenient friend. She was an active participant. Kyle documented their meetings with high-resolution cameras and directional microphones, building a case that would destroy all 3 of them when the time came. The security system has a 40-second delay on the perimeter sensors, Todd was saying during Tuesday night's meeting, his voice clear through Kyle's surveillance equipment. That's our window to get inside. What about his weapons? Amy asked, surprising Kyle with her knowledge of his collection. He's got enough firepower to arm a small militia. That's why we need the drugs, Linda replied coldly. The sedatives will be in his dinner. He'll be unconscious when it happens. Kyle felt a mixture of rage and professional admiration for their thoroughness. They'd studied his routines, identified his security measures, and planned around his military background. If he'd been an ordinary target, their plan might have succeeded. What they didn't know was that Kyle had been conducting his own reconnaissance. Todd Fletcher's financial records revealed debts to some very dangerous people, the kind who collected payments in blood when cash wasn't available. Amy Fletcher had been receiving mysterious cash deposits that corresponded with her ex-husband's visits, suggesting she was being paid for her role in the conspiracy. Most interesting was what Kyle discovered about the insurance policy itself. Linda had increased his coverage 6 months ago, citing his dangerous job as justification. She'd also added a double indemnity clause for accidental death or murder, a detail that would pay out $4 million instead of $2 million. But the real revelation came when Kyle hacked into Todd Fletcher's email accounts. The former Ranger had been corresponding with someone using the alias Kingmaker, encrypted communications that referenced other jobs, other targets, other insurance payouts. Kyle cross-referenced the dates with unsolved murders across Colorado and Wyoming. The pattern was unmistakable. Todd Fletcher wasn't just a bitter ex-husband looking for easy money. He was a professional killer who specialized in making murders look like random home invasions. Linda hadn't just married a target. She'd fallen in love with a serial killer. The discovery changed Kyle's approach entirely. This wasn't just about punishing an unfaithful wife and her lover. He'd stumbled onto something much larger, a network that had been operating for years. As an FBI operative, he had a duty to bring them all down. As a man whose wife had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible, he had a personal score to settle. Kyle began preparing for the endgame. His plan required precision timing and the kind of misdirection that had made him legendary in special operations. Linda and Todd thought they were hunting him, but they were about to learn what it felt like to be prey. He started by planting evidence of his own investigation in places they'd eventually find it. Modified security footage that would make them paranoid, financial records that suggested he was onto their scheme, travel documents indicating he was planning to disappear. The psychological pressure began to show within days. Linda became increasingly nervous, jumping at every sound and asking probing questions about his work schedule. Todd started making mistakes too, using his real phone for conversations he should have kept to the burner. Kyle documented everything, building an ironclad case while simultaneously laying the groundwork for their destruction. When the moment came, he'd have them exactly where he wanted them, trapped in their own web of lies and murder. The hardest part was maintaining his cover at home. Every night, he sat across from Linda at dinner, listening to her talk about her day while knowing she was planning his death. Every kiss, every I love you, every moment of false intimacy was another layer of betrayal that would demand retribution. Kyle Morrison had never been a forgiving man. 12 years of marriage hadn't changed that fundamental aspect of his nature. Linda and her co-conspirators were about to learn that some betrayals carried a price that could only be paid in blood. Chapter 3. The Trap Within a Trap. Wednesday arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Colorado. Kyle went through his normal routine: coffee at 6, brief workout in the basement gym, shower, and breakfast with Linda. She seemed particularly affectionate that morning, which confirmed his suspicions about the timeline. "What time will you be home tonight?" she asked, her voice carefully casual as she buttered toast. "Late," Kyle replied, play his part perfectly. "New case files came in yesterday. I'll probably be in my office until midnight, maybe later." Linda nodded, but Kyle caught the brief flash of relief in her eyes. "I'll leave dinner in the fridge. Don't work too hard, honey." After Linda left for her morning workout, which Kyle knew was actually a final planning session with Todd and Amy, he began the most critical phase of his operation. Every detail had to be perfect, because he'd only get one chance to spring his trap. Kyle's home office contained several features that Linda didn't know about, installed during the renovations he'd insisted on handling personally. Hidden cameras in every room, audio recording devices connected to an off-site server, and most importantly, a panic room behind the bookshelf that could only be accessed by biometric scan. But tonight, Kyle wouldn't be hiding. He'd be hunting. The first step was replacing the sedatives Linda had hidden in the kitchen with harmless supplements that would cause drowsiness without incapacitation. Kyle needed to appear vulnerable while remaining fully alert and capable. Next, he modified his security system to record everything while appearing to malfunction at the crucial moment. Todd and Amy would think they'd successfully disabled his defenses when they'd actually triggered additional layers of surveillance. Most importantly, Kyle had contacted his FBI handler using emergency protocols. Special Agent Rebecca Torres was coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure the entire network will be dismantled simultaneously. But Torres had agreed to Kyle's unconventional approach: let the conspirators commit to their crime before moving in for arrest. As evening approached, Kyle felt the familiar pre-mission calm settling over him. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd lived for during his years in special operations. The only difference was that this time, the mission was deeply personal. At 8 o'clock, Kyle sat down to Linda's carefully prepared dinner: pasta with meat sauce, Caesar salad, and a glass of red wine. He made a show of eating heartily while secretly disposing of most of the food. The wine, which had been spiked with enough sedatives to drop a horse, went into a hidden drain he'd installed beneath his chair. By 9:30, Kyle was pretending to struggle with drowsiness. He stumbled slightly as he walked to his office, making sure Linda saw him from the kitchen where she was cleaning up, actually texting final confirmations to her accomplices. In his office, Kyle positioned himself at his desk with his back to the door, exactly as the conspirators expected. Hidden cameras showed Linda leaving through the back door at 10:15, followed by the careful disabling of exterior security lights. At 10:45, Kyle's modified sensors detected 3 figures approaching the house through the woods. Todd Fletcher carried what appeared to be a crowbar and a knife. Amy Fletcher had a small pistol. Linda was armed with a baseball bat, presumably her assigned weapon for establishing the home invasion narrative. Kyle allowed them to breach the back door and move through his house like the predators they believed themselves to be. His audio equipment captured their whispered communications as they approached his office. "He's out cold," Linda whispered, peering around the doorframe. "Just like we planned." "Remember, it has to look like a struggle," Todd replied. "Beat him unconscious first, then use the knife. Too clean, and the insurance investigators will ask questions." As they entered his office, Kyle spun around in his chair with a Glock 19 in each hand, weapons they hadn't known about because he'd kept them in the panic room. "Surprise," he said quietly. The look of shock and terror on Linda's face was worth 12 years of lies and betrayal. Todd immediately reached for his own weapon, but Kyle had trained with the best soldiers in the world. 2 shots center mass dropped the former Ranger before he could clear his holster. Amy screamed and tried to run, but Kyle's 3rd shot caught her in the leg, sending her crashing into the hallway. She'd lived long enough to stand trial. Linda stood frozen, the baseball bat trembling in her hands. Kyle, I can explain. Explain what? Kyle asked, his voice deadly calm. How you plan to drug me, beat me unconscious, and then watch your boyfriend cut my throat. How you increased my life insurance policy and recruited a serial killer to make it look like a random home invasion. How you've been lying to me for months while planning my murder. Tears streamed down Linda's face, but Kyle felt nothing. The woman he'd loved for 12 years had died the moment he'd heard her voice on that phone call. Please, she whispered. I never meant for it to go this far. Todd, he convinced me. Todd Fletcher has killed at least 6 other people in similar schemes, Kyle interrupted. The FBI has been tracking him for 2 years. You didn't just betray your husband, Linda. You partnered with a monster. The sound of sirens filled the air as FBI agents and local police surrounded the house. Kyle set his weapons on the desk and raised his hands as armed officers flooded his office. Agent Morrison, Rebecca Torres said as she surveyed the scene. Are you injured? Negative, Kyle replied professionally. 3 suspects down, 1 deceased, 2 requiring medical attention. All surveillance recordings have been transmitted to your evidence servers. As paramedics worked on Amy Fletcher and crime scene technicians began documenting everything, Kyle watched Linda being read her rights. She looked back at him with desperate eyes, still hoping for some sign of forgiveness or mercy. Kyle Morrison had been many things in his life, soldier, agent, husband, but he had never been a forgiving man, and tonight had proven that some betrayals were unforgivable. The woman who had been his wife was now just another criminal being processed for the crime of attempting to murder a federal agent. And Kyle felt absolutely nothing as they led her away. Chapter 4. The Reckoning begins. 2 weeks after the failed murder attempt, Kyle Morrison sat in FBI Director Patricia Hayes' office in Denver, reviewing files that made Todd Fletcher's crimes seem almost mundane by comparison. The Kingmaker Network had been operating for 5 years, orchestrating insurance fraud murders across 7 states. 17 confirmed victims, Director Hayes said, sliding photographs across her desk. All targeted because their spouses or beneficiaries wanted the insurance money. Fletcher was just the trigger man. Someone else was running the operation. Kyle studied the crime scene photos with professional detachment. Each murder had been crafted to look like random violence. Home invasions, carjackings, muggings gone wrong. The victims were doctors, lawyers, business owners, all with substantial life insurance policies and spouses eager to collect. What's Linda's cooperation level? Kyle asked. Complete, Hayes replied. She's terrified of the death penalty and willing to testify against everyone involved. Apparently, she was recruited at a grief counseling group for military spouses. Kyle felt a flicker of anger, which he quickly suppressed. Linda had attended those meetings for 6 months, claiming she needed support for the stress of being married to someone with a dangerous job. Instead, she'd been networking with potential accomplices. Amy Fletcher introduced her to the group, Hayes continued. It's a hunting ground, lonely, vulnerable women married to men with high-value insurance policies. They're identified, cultivated, and gradually recruited into the network. Who's running it? Hayes opened another file. Dr. Miranda Voss, a licensed psychologist who founded the grief counseling group. She's been using her professional position to identify targets and manipulate vulnerable people into committing murder. Kyle studied Dr. Voss's photograph. She was an attractive woman in her 50s with a kind of warm, trustworthy face that would put clients at ease. Her credentials were impeccable. Harvard Medical School, decades of experience in trauma counseling, published research on grief and loss. She's currently treating 23 military spouses, Hayes said. We believe at least 6 more murders are in active planning stages. What's my role? Deep cover infiltration, Hayes replied. You'll pose as a recently widowed contractor seeking counseling. Dr. Voss specializes in helping people whose spouses died in violent circumstances, exactly the kind of trauma that would justify your psychological profile. Kyle nodded, already formulating his cover identity. Timeline, immediate. While we're building the federal case, more people are going to die if we don't shut down active operations. You'll be Greg Morrison, no relation to your real identity. Your wife died in a car accident 3 months ago, leaving you with a $2 million insurance policy and survivor's guilt. The irony wasn't lost on Kyle. He'd be posing as a grieving widower while his actual wife sat in a federal holding cell, awaiting trial for attempted murder. But personal feelings had no place in professional operations. I want Linda transferred to maximum security, Kyle said. If Dr. Voss has the reach we suspect, my cover could be blown if Linda talks to the wrong people. Already arranged, Hayes replied. She's in solitary confinement, no contact with other prisoners. The official story is that she's cooperating in a classified terrorism investigation. Kyle spent the next 3 days preparing his cover identity. Greg Morrison was a former Marine turned private security contractor, recently widowed when his wife's car was hit by a drunk driver. The trauma had left him unable to work, struggling with survivor's guilt and rage at a justice system that had given the drunk driver only 5 years in prison. It was a carefully crafted psychological profile designed to appeal to Dr. Voss's recruitment criteria. Greg Morrison was angry, isolated, financially comfortable, and morally flexible enough to consider extreme solutions to his problems. Kyle's first appointment was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Dr. Voss's private practice in downtown Denver. The office was decorated with warm colors and comfortable furniture, designed to put clients at ease. Diplomas and awards covered one wall, while family photos showed Dr. Voss with what appeared to be her husband and 2 grown children. "Thank you for coming, Greg," Dr. Voss said as she welcomed him into her office. Her voice was gentle, professional, exactly what someone would expect from a licensed therapist. "I know this is difficult." Kyle played his role perfectly, describing Greg Morrison's loss with just the right mixture of grief and barely controlled rage. He mentioned the insurance money with embarrassment, as if financial compensation somehow diminished his wife's memory. "Many people struggle with survivor benefits," Dr. Voss said sympathetically. "There's often guilt associated with receiving money because of a loved one's death." "It feels like blood money," Kyle replied, allowing genuine emotion to color his voice. "Like I'm profiting from Sarah's death." Dr. Voss made notes in a leather-bound journal, her pen moving across the page with practiced efficiency. Kyle memorized everything about the office, the security cameras, the locked filing cabinet, the computer that likely contained client records. "Tell me about your anger, Greg," she said after 40 minutes of careful questioning. "You mentioned feeling rage toward the driver who killed Sarah." "He destroyed my life and got 5 years," Kyle replied, his voice hardening. "He'll be out in 3 with good behavior. Meanwhile, Sarah's dead, and I can barely get out of bed in the morning. That must feel deeply unfair." "Justice system's a joke," Kyle said bitterly. "Sometimes I think the only real justice is what we make ourselves." Dr. Voss leaned forward slightly, and Kyle caught the subtle change in her demeanor. This was the moment she began evaluating him as a potential recruit. "Those feelings are completely normal," she said. "Many of my clients express similar thoughts about taking justice into their own hands." Kyle left the appointment with a follow-up session scheduled for the following week. In the parking garage, he activated a secure phone and called Director Hayes. "She's interested," he reported. "Pushing the boundaries, testing my moral flexibility. I'll need at least 3 more sessions before she makes direct contact." "Be careful, Kyle," Hayes warned. "Dr. Voss has a 90% success rate with her recruitment targets. She's very good at manipulating people who are genuinely vulnerable." Kyle understood the warning. The best undercover operatives were those who could genuinely inhabit their cover identities, but that same ability made them vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Dr. Voss had turned dozens of ordinary people into killers by exploiting their grief and rage. But Kyle Morrison wasn't an ordinary person. He was a predator who'd learned to hunt among the most dangerous prey on Earth. Dr. Voss might be skilled at manipulating the vulnerable, but she'd never faced someone who was hunting her in return. The game was about to begin in earnest, and Kyle intended to win. Chapter 5. The Hunter Becomes Hunted. Kyle's second session with Dr. Voss revealed the sophistication of her operation. The psychologist had clearly researched Greg Morrison's background between appointments, testing details of his cover story with casual questions that seemed like therapeutic exploration but were actually verification attempts. "You mentioned your wife worked in real estate," Dr. Voss said, reviewing her notes. "That must have been stressful, dealing with clients and deadlines." "Sarah loved the challenge," Kyle replied, having memorized every detail of his fictional wife's career. "She was one of the top agents in Phoenix before we moved to Denver. The transition was hard on her." Dr. Voss nodded sympathetically, but Kyle caught her subtle glance at a tablet beside her chair. She was cross-referencing his responses with information she'd gathered independently. The woman was thorough, another reason she'd avoided detection for so long. "Have you considered relocating again?" she asked. "Sometimes a change of environment helps with the grieving process." "I can't run from this forever," Kyle said, allowing frustration to bleed into his voice. "Besides, I want to be here when that bastard gets out of prison. I want him to know I'm watching." The session continued for an hour, with Dr. Voss gradually steering the conversation toward themes of justice, revenge, and the failures of the legal system. Kyle responded with carefully calibrated anger, showing enough moral flexibility to interest her without appearing eager. As he left the appointment, Kyle noticed he was being followed. A silver SUV maintained a discreet distance as he drove through downtown Denver, confirming his suspicions about Dr. Voss's thorough screening process. Instead of leading the surveillance team to his safe house, Kyle drove to a gym where Greg Morrison supposedly worked out. He spent 2 hours lifting weights and running on a treadmill, maintaining his cover while using reflective surfaces to study his watchers. The surveillance team was professional, former military or law enforcement, not street thugs. Dr. Voss was using skilled operators to verify her potential recruits, another indication of the network's sophistication. Kyle's third session took place the following Tuesday. This time, Dr. Voss introduced a new element to their discussions. "I'd like you to meet someone," she said after their regular hour of therapy. "Another client who's experienced similar loss. Sometimes group support can be more effective than individual counseling." The woman who entered the office was in her early 40s, attractive in a tired way that suggested recent trauma. She introduced herself as Patricia Wells, a widow whose husband had been killed in a workplace accident 6 months earlier. Patricia's husband was an electrician, Dr. Voss explained. He died because his supervisor cut corners on safety protocols. No criminal charges were filed. Kyle recognized the setup immediately. Patricia Wells was either another potential recruit or an established member of the network, brought in to test his reactions and build trust. Either way, she represented an escalation in Dr. Voss's recruitment process. "It's nice to meet someone who understands," Patricia said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "Most people don't know what it's like to lose someone because of another person's negligence." Kyle played his role, expressing sympathy for Patricia's loss while sharing carefully edited details of his own fictional tragedy. The conversation felt natural, two grieving people finding comfort in shared experience. But Kyle remained alert for signs of manipulation. "Sometimes I fantasize about confronting the supervisor," Patricia admitted, "making him understand what his negligence cost me and my children." "I know exactly what you mean," Kyle replied. "I dream about the drunk driver every night. In my dreams, I make him pay for what he did to Sarah." Dr. Voss watched their interaction with the focused attention of a scientist studying laboratory subjects. Kyle realized this was likely how she identified compatible personalities, potential conspirators who could work together effectively. The session ended with Dr. Voss suggesting that Kyle and Patricia continue meeting outside of her office, perhaps for coffee or lunch. "Sometimes the most healing conversations happen in less formal settings," she said. Kyle agreed, knowing this was the next step in the recruitment process. As he left the office, he noticed the silver SUV was back, but this time there was a second vehicle, a black sedan that followed Patricia Wells when she departed. That evening, Kyle met with Director Hayes at a secure location in suburban Denver. The FBI had been monitoring Dr. Voss's communications and financial records, building a comprehensive picture of her network. "Patricia Wells is legitimate," Hayes reported. "Her husband really did die in a workplace accident, and she's been attending Dr. Voss's group therapy sessions for 4 months. She's being recruited just like you. How many others are in active recruitment? At least 12 that we've identified, Hayes replied. Dr. Voss runs multiple therapy groups, each targeting different demographics. Military spouses, accident victims, families of crime victims, anyone with reason to feel failed by the justice system. Kyle studied surveillance photos of the other potential recruits. They were ordinary people dealing with extraordinary loss, exactly the kind of vulnerable individuals that Dr. Voss specialized in manipulating. What's the end game? Kyle asked. Based on Linda's testimony and our surveillance, Dr. Voss identifies insurance targets through the therapy sessions, then pairs them with suitable assassins from her network. The murders are planned to look random, with the surviving spouses appearing to be victims themselves. And the financial structure, sophisticated, Hayes admitted. Dr. Voss takes 30% of the insurance payouts, laundered through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The assassins get 20%, with the remaining 50% going to the surviving spouse. Kyle felt cold rage building in his chest. Dr. Voss had turned grief counseling into a recruitment pipeline for murder-for-hire schemes, exploiting people at their most vulnerable moments to build a criminal empire. She's been operating for 5 years, Hayes continued. Conservative estimate is 47 murders, generating over $60 million in insurance payouts. Rules of engagement? Full discretion, Hayes replied. Federal prosecutors want the entire network, not just Dr. Voss. That means following the recruitment process to its conclusion, identifying all active conspirators, and gathering evidence of planned murders. Kyle understood. This wasn't just about stopping Dr. Voss. It was about dismantling an organization that had turned ordinary citizens into killers. The operation would require patience, precision, and the kind of moral flexibility that made him suited for undercover work. Timeline for Patricia Wells? Unknown, Hayes admitted. She could be recruited tomorrow or next month. Dr. Voss seems to move at different paces with different targets, depending on their psychological profiles. Kyle nodded, already planning his next moves. Patricia Wells was an innocent woman being manipulated into becoming a killer. Saving her would require careful maneuvering, but Kyle had no intention of allowing Dr. Voss to claim another victim. The hunt was entering its most dangerous phase, where the line between hunter and prey would become increasingly blurred. But Kyle Morrison had spent his career walking that line, and he'd never lost sight of which side he was on. Chapter 6, The Point of No Return. Kyle's 4th session with Dr. Voss took place in her private conference room rather than her usual office, immediately signaling a change in their relationship. The room was windowless and soundproof, decorated with abstract art that created an unsettling atmosphere. I think we've made excellent progress, Greg, Dr. Voss said as she settled into her chair. Your anger is becoming more focused, more purposeful. That's a healthy development. Kyle nodded, maintaining his cover while mentally cataloging every detail of the room. Hidden cameras were almost certainly recording their conversation, but he also noticed what appeared to be jamming devices designed to prevent external surveillance. I've been thinking about what you said last week, Kyle replied, about taking control of my own healing process. And what conclusions have you reached? The system failed Sarah, Kyle said, allowing genuine emotion to color his voice. The courts, the police, the whole justice system, they all failed her. Maybe it's time I stopped waiting for them to make things right. Dr. Voss leaned forward, her professional demeanor shifting slightly. Many of my clients reach similar conclusions. The question becomes, what are you willing to do about it? This was the moment Kyle had been preparing for, the transition from therapy to recruitment. Dr. Voss was about to reveal the true nature of her organization, and Kyle needed to respond with exactly the right mixture of interest and moral uncertainty. I don't know, he said honestly. Part of me wants justice. The other part knows that crossing certain lines changes you forever. Justice and revenge aren't always the same thing, Dr. Voss replied, but sometimes they converge in ways that serve a greater purpose. She stood and walked to a locked cabinet, removing a thick folder that she placed on the table between them. I'd like to share something with you, Greg. stories of other clients who found their own paths to healing. Kyle opened the folder to find case studies that made his blood run cold. Each file detailed a successful murder disguised as random violence, complete with psychological profiles of the surviving spouses and detailed financial breakdowns of the insurance payouts. These people found peace, Dr. Voss said as Kyle reviewed the files. They took control of their circumstances instead of remaining victims. Kyle forced himself to appear interested rather than horrified. Each case study represented a life destroyed by Dr. Voss's manipulation, an ordinary person transformed into a killer through expert psychological conditioning. "This is incredible," he said, allowing awe to creep into his voice. "You helped them do this?" "I provided guidance and support," Dr. Voss replied carefully. "The decisions were always theirs to make." Kyle noticed that several files contained photographs and personal information about potential targets, people whose spouses were currently in Dr. Voss's therapy groups. The scope of her operation was even larger than the FBI had suspected. "What about Patricia?" Kyle asked, testing the boundaries of the conversation. "Patricia is still processing her options," Dr. Voss replied. "Her situation is more complex because of her children. Single mothers face unique challenges when seeking justice." Kyle understood the implication. Dr. Voss was using Patricia's children as leverage, exploiting her maternal instincts to push her toward murder. The psychologist wasn't just recruiting killers. She was systematically destroying families to build her criminal empire. "I want to help her," Kyle said impulsively, knowing it was what Dr. Voss wanted to hear. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think you and Patricia could be very good for each other." The session ended with Dr. Voss scheduling Kyle for what she called advanced counseling, individual sessions focused on practical planning rather than emotional processing. She also arranged for him to meet Patricia Wells that evening at a restaurant downtown. Kyle left the office knowing he'd crossed a crucial threshold. Dr. Voss now viewed him as a committed recruit rather than a potential client, which meant the next phase of the operation would involve detailed planning for actual murders. As he drove to meet Patricia Wells, Kyle activated his secure communication device and updated Director Hayes on the day's developments. "She's accelerating the timeline," Hayes replied. "We're seeing increased activity across all her therapy groups." Something spooked her. Kyle felt a chill of apprehension. If Dr. Voss suspected law enforcement interest, she might be rushing to complete active operations before shutting down and disappearing. That would mean multiple murders happening simultaneously across several states. "Rules of engagement remain the same," Hayes continued. "We need the complete network, but protecting innocent lives takes priority." Kyle understood. If forced to choose between maintaining his cover and preventing murders, he was authorized to break operational security to save lives. His meeting with Patricia Wells took place at a quiet restaurant in Cherry Creek, upscale enough to ensure privacy, but casual enough to appear natural. Patricia arrived looking nervous but determined, clearly having received instructions from Dr. Voss about the evening's agenda. "I'm glad you wanted to meet," she said as they settled into a corner booth. "Dr. Voss says you've been very helpful with your perspective on justice." Kyle studied Patricia's face, seeing the combination of grief, anger, and moral uncertainty that made her vulnerable to Dr. Voss's manipulation. She was a good person being pushed toward an unthinkable act by expert psychological conditioning. "We're both dealing with people who destroyed our lives," Kyle replied carefully. "Maybe we can help each other find closure." Patricia nodded, but Kyle caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Unlike Linda, who had embraced the opportunity for murder and financial gain, Patricia Wells was struggling with the moral implications of what Dr. Voss was asking her to do. "Tell me about your husband's supervisor," Kyle said, following the script he knew Dr. Voss expected. Patricia's expression hardened as she described the man whose negligence had killed her husband. The supervisor had a history of safety violations, had been drunk on the job multiple times, and had actively covered up the conditions that led to the fatal accident. "He's still working," Patricia said bitterly. "Same job, same company, probably cutting the same corners that killed David." Nobody cares because he's management and my husband was just an electrician. Kyle recognized the genuine pain in her voice, the sense of injustice that Dr. Voss had expertly cultivated and directed toward murderous intent. Patricia Wells wasn't evil. She was a grieving widow who'd been systematically manipulated by a master predator. "What does Dr. Voss want you to do?" Kyle asked directly. Patricia looked around nervously before answering. "She says the supervisor has a wife and children. She says if something happened to him, something that looked random, his family would get a large insurance settlement. She says it will be justice for both of us." Kyle felt sick as he understood the full scope of Dr. Voss's manipulation. The psychologist wasn't just turning victims into killers. She was convincing them that murder was an act of compassion, a way to help the families of their targets while achieving their own revenge. "And you'd be willing to do that?" Kyle asked. "I don't know," Patricia replied honestly. "Part of me wants him to suffer like I've suffered. But I keep thinking about his children and what losing their father would do to them." Kyle saw his opportunity. Patricia Wells still had functioning moral instincts, which meant she could potentially be saved from Dr. Voss's influence. But doing so would require careful maneuvering that wouldn't compromise his overall mission. "Maybe there's another way," he said carefully. "Maybe we can find justice without destroying innocent families." Patricia looked at him with desperate hope, and Kyle realized he was now walking the thinnest of lines. He had to maintain his cover while preventing Patricia from becoming a killer, all while gathering evidence against Dr. Voss's entire network. The end game was approaching, and Kyle Morrison had never faced a more complex challenge. Chapter 7: The Web Titans. Kyle's next session with Dr. Voss took place in a different location entirely, a private office in an industrial complex on Denver's outskirts. The change of venue signaled that he'd been accepted into the network's inner circle, but it also meant increased security and surveillance. "Welcome to the real work, Greg," Dr. Voss said as she led him through a maze of corridors to a conference room equipped with multiple monitors and sophisticated communication equipment. "This is where we plan actual solutions." Kyle counted at least 6 security cameras and noted the presence of 2 men who were clearly armed security personnel. Dr. Voss's operation was more militarized than he'd expected, suggesting connections to professional criminal organizations rather than just manipulated therapy clients. "I want to show you something," Dr. Voss continued, activating one of the monitors. The screen displayed a detailed dossier on Patricia Wells' target, her dead husband's supervisor, complete with home address, daily routines, security systems, and family information. "Marcus Webb, age 47, married with 3 children," Dr. Voss read from the file. "Lives in a suburban neighborhood with minimal security. His wife, Teresa, works as a nurse. Children ages 12, 15, and 17. Kyle studied the surveillance photographs, noting the professional quality and comprehensive scope. Someone had been watching the Webb family for weeks, documenting their routines with military precision. "Patricia believes she's making her own decision about Mr. Webb," Dr. Voss continued. "But we both know she needs guidance to follow through effectively." "What kind of guidance?" Kyle asked. Dr. Voss opened another file, revealing detailed plans for Marcus Webb's murder. The scenario was designed to look like a carjacking gone wrong, with Webb being killed while leaving his office late one evening. Patricia would provide an alibi by being seen at a grief counseling group meeting on the other side of town. "The beauty of this approach," Dr. Voss explained, "is that Patricia genuinely believes she's acting alone. If anything goes wrong, there's no connection to our organization." Kyle realized he was looking at the operational template that had been used for dozens of murders over the past 5 years. Dr. Voss didn't just recruit killers. She provided them with detailed murder plans while maintaining plausible deniability. "What's my role?" he asked. "You'll be Patricia's partner," Dr. Voss replied. "Someone to provide emotional support and ensure she follows through. In exchange, we'll help you deal with your own justice problem." She activated another monitor, displaying a comprehensive dossier on the fictional drunk driver who had supposedly killed Greg Morrison's wife. Kyle had to admire the thorough backstory his FBI handlers had created. The target even had a real address and daily routine. Robert Chun, currently serving 5 years for vehicular manslaughter, Dr. Voss read. Scheduled for release in 18 months with good behavior. Lives alone, works as a mechanic, no close family ties. Kyle felt a chill as he realized Dr. Voss was planning to have an innocent man murdered to maintain his cover. The fictional drunk driver was actually a real person, a mechanic who had no idea he'd been selected as a murder target. That's very thorough, Kyle said, fighting to keep his voice steady. We believe in comprehensive solutions, Dr. Voss replied. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice properly planned is justice served. The session continued for 2 hours, with Dr. Voss outlining the timeline for both murders. Patricia would kill Marcus Webb within the next 2 weeks, while Kyle would eliminate Robert Chin shortly after his release from prison. Both murders would be coordinated to look unrelated, protecting the network's operational security. As Kyle left the industrial complex, he activated his emergency communication protocol and requested immediate extraction. The situation had escalated beyond acceptable parameters. Innocent people were about to be murdered, and his cover identity was being used to target a civilian. Director Hayes met him at a secure location within an hour, accompanied by a full tactical team and prosecutors from the Justice Department. We're moving tonight, Hayes announced. Dr. Voss has accelerated operations across all her networks. We've identified 17 potential murders scheduled for the next month. Kyle reviewed the operational briefing with growing alarm. Dr. Voss had been busier than anyone suspected, running recruitment operations in 6 different states with dozens of active conspirators. The network included not just manipulated therapy clients, but also professional criminals who handled logistics, surveillance, and operational security. What about Patricia Wells? Kyle asked. She's been arrested, Hayes replied. Picked up an hour ago on conspiracy charges. She's cooperating fully and will testify against Dr. Voss in exchange for reduced charges. Kyle felt relief that Patricia had been saved from becoming a killer, but the broader situation remained critical. Dr. Voss still had multiple operations in progress, and she'd proven capable of adapting quickly to changing circumstances. The industrial complex is our primary target, Hayes continued. Full tactical assault at 0300 hours. Your job is to identify key personnel and ensure no evidence is destroyed. Kyle studied the floor plans and personnel files, noting potential escape routes and defensive positions. Dr. Voss had chosen her location well, multiple exits, defensible positions, and enough advance warning to destroy critical evidence if law enforcement approached carelessly. She'll have contingency plans, Kyle warned. This woman has been running a successful criminal enterprise for 5 years. She won't go down easily. That's why we're bringing overwhelming force, Hayes replied. FBI tactical teams, local SWAT, and federal marshals. Dr. Voss is done playing games with vulnerable people. As Kyle prepared for the raid, he thought about Linda sitting in her federal holding cell, awaiting trial for attempted murder. His wife had been Dr. Voss's first failure, a recruitment that had led to exposure rather than success. The irony was bitter but satisfying. Dr. Miranda Voss had spent years turning grief into murder, exploiting the most vulnerable people in society to build her criminal empire. Tonight, she would learn what it felt like to be hunted by someone who understood exactly how predators operated. Kyle Morrison had been patient, professional, and methodical throughout the investigation. Now it was time to end the game, and he intended to make sure Dr. Voss never had the opportunity to manipulate another grieving family. The hunt was nearly over, and Kyle felt the familiar calm that came before decisive action. Some predators could be captured and caged. Others had to be destroyed completely to protect innocent people from their hunger. Dr. Voss was about to discover which category she belonged to. Chapter 8, The Final Hunt. The industrial complex was a fortress in the pre-dawn darkness, but Kyle Morrison had spent years learning how to breach fortified positions. As the FBI tactical team prepared for their assault, Kyle studied the building through night vision scopes, identifying security cameras, motion sensors, and potential defensive positions. Target building has 4 armed guards on perimeter, he reported through his communication headset. rotating patrols every 15 minutes, with blind spots on the north and east sides. Director Hayes coordinated the assault from a mobile command center, monitoring communications and surveillance feeds from multiple agencies. Dr. Voss is still inside, she confirmed. Thermal imaging shows at least 12 people in the main conference room. Kyle checked his equipment one final time. Unlike the other agents, he wasn't planning to make arrests. His role was intelligence gathering and target identification. But he also carried enough firepower to handle unexpected complications, because Dr. Voss had proven herself capable of extreme measures. All teams in position, Hayes announced over the tactical frequency. Commence operation in 3, 2, execute. Kyle moved through the darkness with the fluid precision of a predator returning to familiar territory. While the main assault teams breached the primary entrances, he used a service corridor to access the building's interior undetected. The first thing Kyle noticed was the silence. A facility that should have been bustling with activity was eerily quiet, suggesting that Dr. Voss had detected the law enforcement presence and activated defensive protocols. Kyle's suspicions were confirmed when he reached the main conference room and found it empty, except for a single note taped to the table. Agent Morrison, I've been expecting you. The realization hit him like ice water. Dr. Voss had known about his undercover operation from the beginning, had been playing him just as expertly as she'd manipulated her therapy clients. Kyle activated his emergency communication device, but found only static. The building was being jammed. Looking for these? Dr. Voss's voice came from speakers hidden throughout the room. I'm afraid your FBI friends are experiencing some technical difficulties. Kyle drew his weapon and moved toward the exits, but found them sealed with electromagnetic locks that wouldn't respond to his override codes. He was trapped in a room with no windows and only one way out, through Dr. Voss herself. I must admit, you were very convincing, her voice continued. The grieving widower seeking justice, struggling with moral boundaries. If I hadn't run background checks on every new client, you might have succeeded. Kyle remained silent, using the time to examine the room for hidden passages or weaknesses in the walls. Dr. Voss was talking to keep him distracted while she implemented whatever final gambit she'd prepared. Your wife Linda was quite helpful, Dr. Voss continued. Amazing how much information people reveal when they think they're about to die. She told Todd Fletcher all about your military background, your FBI position, even your operational methods. Kyle felt cold rage building in his chest. Linda hadn't just betrayed him personally. She'd compromised his professional cover and endangered his life. I've been planning this conversation for weeks, Dr. Voss said. The question is, what exactly did you think you were hunting? The lights in the conference room dimmed, and Kyle heard the distinctive sound of multiple weapons being cocked. Red laser dots appeared on his chest as armed figures emerged from concealed positions throughout the room. Dr. Miranda Voss doesn't exist. The voice continued as a woman stepped into view. She was younger than the photograph suggested, with short dark hair and the kind of predatory smile Kyle had seen on the faces of enemy combatants. She's a cover identity I've been using for 5 years while building something much more significant than your FBI investigators suspected. Kyle kept his weapon trained on her while counting potential targets. 6 armed personnel, all positioned to create crossfire zones that would make escape impossible. Professional deployment suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. What exactly have you been building? Kyle asked, playing for time while studying defensive positions. A network, she replied. Not just insurance fraud, but recruitment and training for a much larger organization. Every person I've manipulated, every murder I've orchestrated has been a screening process for identifying assets with the right psychological profiles. Kyle understood with growing horror. Dr. Voss hadn't been running a criminal enterprise. She'd been recruiting and testing potential operatives for something much worse. Some of my clients become killers, she continued. Others become sources of information, infiltrating law enforcement and government agencies. A few exceptional individuals, like your wife, become unwitting intelligence assets. Linda was never an asset, Kyle said. She was married to an FBI undercover agent for 12 years, Dr. Voss replied. Amazing what someone can learn by simply listening to phone conversations and reading personal documents. Linda provided us with operational intelligence she didn't even know she was gathering. Kyle's tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but he noticed something important. The armed personnel were positioned to capture rather than kill. Dr. Voss wanted him alive, which suggested she had plans that required his cooperation. "What do you want?" he asked directly. "Your expertise," she replied. 12 years of marriage to a federal agent, combined with your own military and intelligence background. You understand how law enforcement operates, how they think, how they can be defeated. Kyle laughed, a sound without humor. "You think I work for you?" "I think you understand survival," Dr. Voss replied. "Your FBI friends are currently dealing with explosive devices throughout this building. They have approximately 10 minutes to evacuate before the charges detonate. You can save their lives by agreeing to join my organization." Kyle felt the familiar calm of a soldier facing impossible odds. Dr. Voss had planned thoroughly, but she'd made one critical mistake. She assumed Kyle Morrison was someone who could be negotiated with, someone who would compromise his principles to save lives. "Counter-proposal," Kyle said quietly. "I kill everyone in this room, then disarm your explosives myself." Dr. Voss smiled. "You're outnumbered 6-1, Agent Morrison. Even with your legendary skills, those aren't favorable odds." Kyle's response was to dive behind the conference table while opening fire on the nearest target. His first 3 shots dropped 2 of the armed guards before they could react, while his 4th shot shattered the room's main light fixture. In the darkness that followed, Kyle Morrison became what he'd always been beneath the cover identities and professional facades. A predator whose natural habitat was chaos and violence. The hunt was finally entering its natural conclusion, and Dr. Voss was about to learn why Kyle Morrison had never failed to complete a mission. Chapter 9. Blood and Retribution. In the darkness of the conference room, Kyle Morrison moved like a wraith among enemies who'd spent too much time believing in their own superiority. The remaining 4 guards had tactical training, but Kyle had something they lacked: years of killing in environments where hesitation meant death. His 5th shot took out a guard who was using a muzzle flash to locate Kyle's position. The 6th found another guard who'd made the mistake of trying to flank him. By the time Dr. Voss realized her tactical advantage had evaporated, half her security team was dead. "Lights!" she screamed, but Kyle had already destroyed the electrical panel with a well-placed shot. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting blood-red shadows throughout the room. Kyle used the chaos to close distance with the remaining guards, engaging them in close-quarters combat, where his superior training became decisive. The 7th target went down to a combat knife thrust between the ribs. The 8th tried to surrender, but Kyle Morrison didn't take prisoners from people who'd threatened federal agents with explosives. When the violence ended, Kyle stood alone with Dr. Voss in a room filled with bodies. She was pressed against the far wall, holding a detonator in her trembling hands. "Stay back," she warned. "I'll bring down the whole building." "Go ahead," Kyle replied calmly, walking toward her with his weapon trained on her chest. "We both know you're not planning to die here tonight." Dr. Voss's eyes widened as she realized Kyle had read her psychology correctly. She was a predator, not a fanatic, someone who killed for personal gain rather than ideological commitment. Such people never chose death when life remained an option. "I can make you rich," she said desperately. "My organization has contracts worth millions of dollars. Government agencies, private corporations, criminal syndicates. Everyone needs assets who can infiltrate and eliminate targets." Kyle reached her position and knocked the detonator from her hands with a casual backhand that sent her sprawling to the floor. "I already have a job," he said. "Please," she begged, blood trickling from her split lip. "I can give you information. Names, locations, operational plans. The network is bigger than you imagine." Kyle stood over her, studying the woman who'd spent years turning grief into murder. Dr. Voss had exploited the most vulnerable people in society, turning their pain into weapons for her own enrichment. She'd manipulated his wife into attempting murder, compromised federal operations, and planned to kill innocent civilians to maintain her cover. "You're right about one thing," Kyle said quietly. I do understand survival. He pulled the pins from 2 grenades and dropped them at Dr. Voss's feet. The difference between us is that I understand who deserves to survive and who doesn't. Kyle was already moving toward the emergency exit when the explosions lit up the conference room. The electromagnetic locks had been disabled by the blast, allowing him to escape the building as FBI tactical teams breached the perimeter. Director Hayes found him in the parking lot, watching smoke pour from the industrial complex's windows. "Status report," she demanded. "Dr. Voss is dead," Kyle replied, "along with her security team and any explosives they might have planted." Hayes studied his face in the reflected light of the burning building. "The official report will show she died resisting arrest during a federal raid. You were never inside the building." Kyle nodded, understanding the necessity of maintaining operational security. His methods might not have been strictly legal, but they'd been effective in ways that a traditional arrest could never accomplish. "What about the network?" Hayes asked. "We have enough evidence from the files to roll up the entire operation," Kyle replied. 17 states, dozens of active conspirators, and a client list that reads like a who's who of organized crime. 3 weeks later, Kyle Morrison sat in a federal courtroom watching Linda testify against her former co-conspirators. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished by months in federal custody and the knowledge that her decisions had led to multiple deaths. When she finished her testimony, Linda looked directly at Kyle for the first time since her arrest. Her eyes held desperate hope for some sign of forgiveness, some indication that their 12 years of marriage had meant something. Kyle stared back with the expression of a man looking at a stranger. Whatever love he'd felt for Linda Morrison had died the moment he'd heard her planning his murder. The woman in the witness box was just another criminal whose testimony would help convict other criminals. Linda's face crumpled as she understood. Kyle Morrison was not a forgiving man, and some betrayals could never be forgiven or forgotten. She'd chosen Todd Fletcher and his promises of easy money over the husband who would have died for her. Now she would live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life. After the trial, Kyle returned to his work with the FBI, specializing in undercover operations that required his particular combination of skills and moral flexibility. He never remarried, never trusted anyone enough to share the deeper truths of his nature. The house in Maple Ridge was sold, the proceeds donated to a charity for military families. Kyle kept nothing that reminded him of his former life, except for one item, Linda's wedding ring, which he carried in his pocket as a reminder that love could be weaponized just as effectively as hatred. 6 months later, Kyle received word that Linda had been found dead in her prison cell, apparently a suicide. The note she left contained only 4 words. "I'm sorry, Kyle Morrison." Kyle felt nothing when he read the report. Linda Morrison had made her choices and lived with the consequences. Her death changed nothing. It certainly didn't erase 12 years of lies or resurrect the man Kyle had been before discovering her betrayal. Some betrayals carve scars so deep they change the fundamental nature of who a person could become. Kyle Morrison had learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible, and he'd emerged from the experience as something harder and more dangerous than the man who'd once believed in love and forgiveness. The hunter had survived, but the husband had died along with everyone who betrayed him. And Kyle Morrison was perfectly content with that outcome. In his new life, Kyle Morrison trusted no one completely and forgave nothing. He'd become exactly what the world had taught him to be, a predator who protected the innocent by destroying those who would prey upon them. It was a lonely existence, but it was honest in ways that his marriage had never been. And for Kyle Morrison, honesty was the only foundation worth building a life upon. The game was over. The hunter had won. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.